In the pre-dawn darkness of August 1st, 1945, the massive airfields of Guam, Saipan, and Tinian hummed with the sound of 1,700 Wright R-3350 engines spinning to life. Across the three islands, ground crews made final preparations as 836 B-29s staged the largest single raid of World War II, dropping 6,145 tons of bombs and mines. This was no ordinary mission. This was the crescendo of a campaign that would systematically obliterate what remained of Japan's once mighty air power in a matter of hours, reducing an empire that had once dominated the Pacific skies to a collection of burning airfields and scattered wreckage. By August 1945, Japan's imperial air forces, both Army and Navy, faced complete annihilation. Strict conservation of available aviation fuel grounded most of Japan's still considerable numbers of combat aircraft. The empire that had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor, that had swept across Southeast Asia with seemingly unstoppable aerial armadas, now found its aircraft sitting as helpless targets on the ground, their fuel tanks empty, their pilots either dead or so inexperienced they could barely take off, much less engage in combat against veteran American airmen flying superior aircraft. The destruction of Japan's air power had not happened overnight. It was the culmination of a systematic campaign that combined unprecedented industrial might with revolutionary tactical innovation. But in these final days, the pace of destruction accelerated beyond anything history had ever witnessed. Japanese aircraft that had once terrorized Allied forces across the Pacific were being destroyed faster than they could be manufactured, faster than they could be moved to safety, faster than their depleted crews could even comprehend the magnitude of the disaster befalling them. The architects of this aerial apocalypse understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented. By the end of 1943, the Army and Navy had lost about 10,000 pilots. As American Lieutenant General George C. Kenney reported to Washington, Japan's originally highly trained crews were superb, but they are dead. The flower of Japan's aviation had already been cut down in the savage battles over the Solomons, at Midway, during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and in countless other engagements. What remained were hastily trained replacements flying increasingly obsolete aircraft against overwhelming odds. The scale of Japan's pilot crisis reflected a fundamental collapse in their military aviation system. Home island flight instructors were faced with too many students to train them effectively. The urgency of training pilots overwhelmed the curriculum. We couldn't watch for individual errors and take the long hours necessary to weed the faults out of a trainee, Sakai recalled in 1943. Hardly a day passed when fire engines and ambulances did not race down the runways, sirens shrieking, to dig one or more pilots out of the plane they had wrecked on a clumsy takeoff or landing. This training crisis created a death spiral that Japan could not escape. Inexperienced pilots were shot down quickly, creating demand for even more hastily trained replacements, while the few veteran instructors remaining were spread ever thinner across an impossible training load. We were told to rush men through, Sakai said, to forget the fine points, just teach them how to fly and shoot. The result was a generation of Japanese pilots who were little more than suicide volunteers flying obsolete aircraft against the most experienced and best-equipped air force in history. The infrastructure supporting Japanese air power was equally degraded. Ground crews wore themselves out pushing aircraft around fields. They worked at night to avoid Allied air attacks, only to fall victim to the malaria mosquito, which was most active at night. Men worked 7 days a week in wretched weather at exhausting and mind-numbing tasks. Ground crews became nervous and irritable from lack of sleep. The Japanese war machine was consuming itself from within. even as Allied bombers prepared to deliver the coup de grace from above. The strategic situation facing Japan by August 1945 was hopeless beyond redemption. The Allied submarine campaign and the mining of Japanese coastal waters had largely destroyed the Japanese merchant fleet. The destruction of the Japanese merchant fleet, combined with the strategic bombing of Japanese industry, had wrecked Japan's war economy. Production of coal, iron, steel, rubber, and other vital supplies was only a fraction of that before the war. Without fuel, without spare parts, without raw materials, Japan's air force existed mainly on paper. The naval component of Japan's air power had already been effectively eliminated as a fighting force. As a result of the losses it had suffered, the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, had ceased to be an effective fighting force. Following a series of raids on the Japanese shipyard at Kure, the only major warships in somewhat fighting order were 6 aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers, and 1 battleship, of which many were heavily damaged and none could be fueled adequately. The carrier air arm that had struck Pearl Harbor so devastatingly was now a memory, its aircraft carriers serving as floating targets in harbors they dared not leave. Against this backdrop of collapse and desperation, American air power had reached its zenith. The B-29 Superfortress, deployed in unprecedented numbers, could strike any target in Japan with virtual impunity. Fighter escorts from bases captured across the Pacific provided comprehensive protection, while the systematic destruction of Japanese airfields eliminated any remaining threat from interceptor aircraft. The mathematical imbalance was staggering. Where Japan could manage perhaps a few dozen serviceable fighters, the United States could deploy over 1,000. The kamikaze program, Japan's final desperate gambit to somehow inflict decisive damage on Allied forces, had already proven itself a costly failure that only accelerated the destruction of what remained of Japanese air power. The Japanese expended 2,600 aircraft in kamikaze attacks, and with them the lives of 4,000 airmen. The attacks killed more than 7,000 Allied naval personnel and wounded many more. The Japanese overestimated how many kamikaze would be able to evade Allied fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The effectiveness of the kamikaze campaign reflected Japan's fundamental misunderstanding of the new realities of air warfare. Allied pilots were more experienced, better trained, and flying superior aircraft, making the poorly trained kamikaze pilots easy targets. The U.S. Fast Carrier Task Force alone could bring over 1,000 fighter aircraft into play. Allied pilots became adept at destroying enemy aircraft before they struck ships. What had been conceived as a weapon of terror became instead a machine for consuming Japan's remaining aircraft and pilots with no strategic benefit. The statistics of kamikaze effectiveness told the story of a failed strategy. Around 350 vessels were hit by kamikaze. 47 were sunk, and the rest were damaged. Of the ships sunk, none were strategically important, and all could be replaced. But the kamikaze could never inflict enough damage to derail Allied naval operations. Japan was trading its most precious and irreplaceable resource, trained pilots and modern aircraft, for tactical results that had no strategic significance whatsoever. Even the purpose-built suicide weapons represented a colossal waste of resources that Japan could not afford. Post-war analysis concluded that the Oka's impact was negligible, since no U.S. Navy capital ships had been hit during the attacks because of the effective defensive tactics that were employed. In total, of the 300 Oka available for the Okinawa campaign, 74 actually undertook operations, of which 56 were either destroyed with their parent aircraft or in making attacks. These rocket-powered suicide bombs required large transport aircraft to carry them into combat, and both the Okas and their motherships were being systematically destroyed by Allied fighters long before they could reach their targets. The final irony of Japan's air strategy was that their most desperate measures only hastened their complete defeat. The last Allied vessel to be sunk by a kamikaze was the destroyer USS Callahan, which was hit by a K-5Y2 biplane on 28 July 1945. The aircraft's two 30-kilo 666 Libelon bombs detonated Callahan's AA ammunition, and she sank in no more than 90 minutes. This attack, using an obsolete training aircraft converted to suicide bombing, symbolized the depth of Japan's desperation and the poverty of their remaining options. By August 1945, American strategy had evolved to capitalize completely on Japan's aerial weakness. Due to the lack of Japanese air opposition to the American bomber raids, 7 Fighter Command was solely tasked with ground attack missions from July. These raids were frequently made against airfields to destroy aircraft being held in reserve. American fighters, no longer needed to escort bombers against Japanese interceptors, could devote their full attention to hunting down and destroying Japanese aircraft on the ground. The systematic destruction of Japanese airfields had become a primary objective of American operations. The first of these operations took place on 16 April, when 57 P-51s strafed Kanoya Airfield in Kyushu. In operations conducted between 26 April and 22 June, the American fighter pilots claimed the destruction of 64 Japanese aircraft and damage to another 180 on the ground, as well as a further 10 shot down in flight. These claims were lower than the American planners had expected, however, and the raids were considered unsuccessful. USAAF losses were 11 P-51s to enemy action and 7 to other causes. The unsuccessful nature of these attacks from the American perspective reflected just how completely Japanese air power had already been degraded. American planners had expected to find more targets, but the systematic destruction of previous months had already eliminated most Japanese aircraft. The few that remained were increasingly difficult to locate, hidden in dispersed sites or camouflaged beyond effective use. Japan's air force was not merely being defeated, it was being hunted to extinction. The scale of American bombing operations in these final months defied comprehension. The strikes conducted by the USAAF on the night of 9 to 10 March 1945, codenamed Operation Meeting House, constitute the single most destructive aerial bombing raid in human history. Approximately 15.8 square miles, 4,090 ha, of the city were destroyed, and some 100,000 people are estimated to have been killed. A total of 282 out of 339 B-29s launched for Meeting House reached Tokyo, 27 of which were lost due to being shot down by Japanese air defenses, mechanical failure, or being caught in massive updrafts caused by the fires below. The March firebombing of Tokyo marked a turning point, not just in the destruction of Japan's cities, but in the complete collapse of any meaningful air defense. The loss of 27 B-29s represented one of the heaviest single-day losses for American bomber forces in the Pacific, yet it constituted less than 8% of the attacking force. For Japan, the failure to inflict heavier losses on such a massive raid demonstrated the complete inadequacy of their remaining air defenses against the new realities of strategic bombing. The targeting philosophy behind these raids reflected American recognition that Japan's war industry was inextricably integrated with its urban population centers. The destruction caused by low-altitude nighttime firebombing wiped out much of the dispersed light industry that provided a crucial source for small machine parts for Japanese war manufacturing. Firebombing also killed or made homeless many factory workers critical to the war effort. According to American intelligence in early 1945, over 50% of Tokyo's industry was spread out among residential and commercial neighborhoods. The destruction of these neighborhoods in firebombing raids cut the whole city's output in half. The psychological impact of these raids on Japanese leadership was immediate and decisive. Emperor Hirohito's tour of the destroyed areas of Tokyo in March 1945 ended his relative lack of involvement in the Japanese wartime decision-making process. Seeing the devastation firsthand convinced the emperor that continued resistance was futile, beginning the internal political process that would eventually lead to surrender. The tempo of destruction accelerated dramatically through the summer of 1945. On the first of the month, 836 B-29s staged the largest single raid of World War II, dropping 6,145 tons of bombs and mines. The cities of Hachioji, Mito, Nagaoka, and Toyama were the main targets of this operation. All four suffered extensive damage, and 99.5% of Seo buildings in Toyama were destroyed. This was not strategic bombing in any traditional sense. This was the systematic obliteration of an entire nation's capacity to function. The mining campaign that accompanied the bombing raids had equally devastating effects on Japan's ability to sustain military operations. Overall, mines dropped by superfortresses off the home islands sank 293 ships, which represented 9.3% of all Japanese merchant shipping destroyed during the Pacific War, and 60% of losses between April and August 1945. With Japan's shipping lifelines severed, their remaining aircraft sat without fuel, without spare parts, without any hope of meaningful operations against the Allied aerial armadas. The few occasions when Japanese forces attempted to mount meaningful resistance only highlighted their desperate situation. Another unsuccessful raid was conducted against Yawata on 20th of August, in which the B-29 force was intercepted by over 100 fighters. 12 of the 61 superfortresses that reached the target area were shot down, including one which was destroyed in a suicide ramming attack. Japanese government propaganda claimed that 100 bombers had been downed during this attack, and one of the crashed B-29s was placed on display in Tokyo. This August 20th raid represented one of Japan's final attempts at organized air defense, and the results were telling. Despite assembling over 100 fighters, a significant portion of their remaining operational aircraft, and resorting to suicide ramming attacks, Japanese forces managed to shoot down only 12 bombers from a force of 61. The propaganda claims of 100 bombers destroyed fooled no one who understood the mathematical realities of the air war, but such exaggerations reflected the desperate need to maintain morale in the face of overwhelming defeat. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki represented the ultimate expression of American air supremacy. But they were only the culmination of a campaign that had already broken Japan's will and capacity to resist. A gigantic mushroom cloud rising above Hiroshima, Japan, on August 6, 1945, after a U.S. aircraft dropped an atomic bomb on the city, immediately killing more than 70,000 people. The Enola Gay flew to its target without meaningful opposition, dropped its weapon, and returned safely to base. No Japanese interceptors threatened the mission. No anti-aircraft fire reached the aircraft. Japan's vaunted air defenses had ceased to exist. The second atomic bombing 3 days later proceeded with similar impunity. The city of Nagasaki, however, was not the primary target for the second atomic bomb. The B-29 Boxcar, piloted Major Charles Sweeney, was assigned to deliver the Fat Man to the city of Kokura on the morning of August 9th, 1945. At 3:49 a.m., Boxcar and 5 other B-29s departed the island of Tinian and headed towards Kokura. When the plane arrived over the city nearly 7 hours later, thick clouds and drifting smoke from fires started by a major firebombing raid on nearby Yawata. The previous day covered most of the area over Kokura, obscuring the aiming point. Pilot Charles Sweeney made 3 bomb runs over the next 50 minutes, but Bombardier Behan was unable to drop the bomb because he could not see the target visually. The irony was profound. Japan's inability to clear their own skies of smoke from conventional bombing raids prevented the atomic bombers from finding their primary target, forcing them to attack their secondary target instead. The conventional bombing campaign had become so overwhelming that it was interfering with nuclear targeting. This was the measure of American air supremacy. They controlled Japanese skies so completely that Japanese fires were the only obstacle to American nuclear delivery systems. Even as Japan moved toward surrender, American air operations continued to demonstrate their complete dominance. In the largest and longest bombing raid of the Pacific War, more than 400 B-29s attacked Japan during daylight on 14th August, and more than 300 that night. A total of 1,014 aircraft were used with no losses. Over 1,000 Allied aircraft struck Japanese targets on the final day of the war without losing a single plane to enemy action. This was not warfare in any traditional sense. This was target practice conducted against a defenseless enemy. The final acts of Japanese air resistance came not from organized military units, but from rogue pilots acting without authorization. On 18th August, a group of 4 B-32s overflying Tokyo were attacked by Japanese naval fighter aircraft from Naval Air Facility Atsugi and Yokosuka Naval Airfield. The Japanese pilots were acting without authorization from the Japanese government. These unauthorized attacks represented the death throes of Japanese military aviation, individual pilots making desperate gestures of defiance against overwhelming Allied power. The scale of destruction inflicted on Japanese aviation during 1945 represented more than military defeat. It represented the complete obliteration of a military culture and tradition. Japan's air forces had been built around concepts of individual pilot skill, spiritual dedication, and technological innovation. The systematic destruction of their pilot training programs, fuel supplies, aircraft production facilities, and airfield infrastructure had eliminated all 3 foundations of their air power. The technological gap between Japanese and American aircraft had become insurmountable by 1945. The Battle of Midway, the Solomon Islands Campaign, 1942-1945, and the New Guinea Campaign, 1942-1945. Notably, the naval battles of the Eastern Solomons, August 1942, and Santa Cruz Islands, October 1942, decimated the IGNIS veteran aircrews, and replacing their combat experience proved impossible. During 1943-1944, U.S. forces steadily advanced toward Japan. Newer U.S.-made aircraft, especially the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and Vought F-4U Corsair, outclassed and soon outnumbered Japan's fighters. Tropical diseases, as well as shortages of spare parts and fuel, made operations more and more difficult for the IGNIS. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 had delivered the decisive blow to Japanese carrier aviation. By the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944, the Japanese had to make do with obsolete aircraft and inexperienced aviators in the fight against better-trained and more experienced U.S. Navy airmen who flew radar-directed combat air patrols. The Japanese lost over 400 carrier-based aircraft and pilots in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, effectively destroying the IJN's carrier air arm. Allied aviators called the action the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. This single engagement had broken the back of Japanese naval aviation eliminating in one day the accumulated expertise and aircraft of years of preparation. The Turkey Shoot nickname reflected not just American victory, but the one-sided nature of the engagement. Experienced American pilots in superior aircraft systematically destroying waves of Japanese attackers with minimal losses to themselves. The infrastructure problems plaguing Japanese aviation became increasingly insurmountable as the war progressed. Japan had not developed a robust civil engineering infrastructure. Picks, shovels, manpower, and horsepower provided the backbone of Japanese engineering activities. In the first 10 months of war, the Japanese Navy managed to complete only one new airbase at Buin on Bougainville, and it had only one runway. Important though that base was, it was a rough field, and 7 of 15 Zeros were badly damaged when they landed there on October 8, 1942. The inability to construct adequate airfields reflected broader problems with Japanese industrial capacity and logistical planning. Without properly constructed airstrips, Japanese aircraft were vulnerable to weather, difficult to maintain, and prone to accidents during takeoff and landing. American forces, meanwhile, were constructing massive air complexes with concrete runways, maintenance facilities, fuel storage, and comprehensive defensive systems. The contrast in engineering capability reflected the broader disparity in industrial capacity that would ultimately determine the war's outcome. The final stages of the air war saw desperate Japanese attempts to preserve some vestige of their aviation capability for the anticipated invasion of the home islands. Obsolete aircraft such as Yokosuka K-5Y biplane trainers were also converted to kamikazes. During 1945, the Japanese military began stockpiling Tsurugi, Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, other aircraft and suicide boats for use against Allied forces expected to invade Japan. The invasion never happened, and few were ever used. These preparations for homeland defense revealed the depths of Japanese desperation. Converting training aircraft to suicide bombers and stockpiling purpose-built suicide weapons represented the complete abandonment of any hope for conventional military success. The innovative but ultimately futile nature of Japanese final preparations was exemplified by aircraft like the Nakajima Ki-115 Tsurugi. The Nakajima Ki-115 Tsurugi was a simple, easily built propeller aircraft with a wooden airframe that used engines from existing stocks. This aircraft, designed as a disposable suicide weapon, represented everything wrong with Japan's aviation strategy in 1945. Improvisation instead of systematic development, suicide missions instead of professional tactics, wooden construction instead of advanced materials. It was a weapon born of desperation, built by a nation that had already lost the technological and industrial war. American defensive innovations had evolved specifically to counter the remaining Japanese air threat. Commander John Thatch, already famous for developing effective aerial tactics against the Japanese, such as the Thatch Weave, developed a defensive strategy against kamikazes called the Big Blue Blanket to establish Allied air supremacy well away from the carrier force. This recommended combat air patrols, CAP, that were larger and operated farther from the carriers than before. A line of picket destroyers and destroyer escorts at least 80 kilometers 50 centimeters from the main body of the fleet to provide earlier radar interception and improved coordination between fighter direction officers on carriers. This plan also called for around-the-clock fighter patrols over Allied fleets. A final element included intensive fighter sweeps over Japanese airfields and bombing Japanese runways, using delayed action bombs, making repairs more difficult. These defensive innovations demonstrated how completely American strategy had adapted to Japanese tactics, creating multiple layered defenses that made successful Japanese air attacks virtually impossible. The big blue blanket concept pushed the defensive perimeter so far from Allied shipping that Japanese aircraft had to penetrate hundreds of miles of controlled airspace, facing continuous interception by superior aircraft flown by experienced pilots before they could even attempt to attack their targets. The final evidence of Japanese air power's complete collapse came in their inability to meaningfully oppose even reconnaissance flights over their homeland. U.S. B-32 Dominator bombers based in Okinawa began flying reconnaissance missions over Japan in order to monitor Japanese compliance with the ceasefire, gather information to better enable the establishment of the occupation, and test the fidelity of the Japanese, as it was feared that the Japanese were planning to attack occupation forces. During the first such B-32 reconnaissance mission, the bomber was tracked by Japanese radars but completed its mission without interference. Japan could track American reconnaissance aircraft, but could do nothing to intercept them, the ultimate symbol of their aerial impotence. The mathematical reality of Japan's situation by August 1945 was stark beyond comprehension. American industrial capacity was producing aircraft at rates that dwarfed Japanese manufacturing even at its wartime peak, while Japanese production had collapsed due to bombing, material shortages, and the breakdown of their transportation system. American pilot training programs were producing experienced air crews faster than Japan could train replacement pilots, while Japanese training had deteriorated to the point where graduates were barely capable of basic flight operations. The strategic implications of Japan's aerial collapse extended far beyond military considerations. Later that day, they received U.S. President Truman's broadcast announcing the first use of an atomic bomb and promising, "We are now prepared to obliterate more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have above ground in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war." This was not an idle threat. American air power had already demonstrated its ability to systematically destroy Japanese cities, infrastructure, and military capacity at will. The horror of the firebombing campaigns had already exceeded the destruction of the atomic bombs in many respects. A March 9-10 fire raid on the capital of Tokyo killed 100,000 people. The deadliest air raid in human history, a toll worse than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It, and subsequent raids, destroyed about 60% of the city, leaving about 1 million people homeless. The worst-hit city was Toyama, 99% destroyed, on August 1st. When a conventional bombing raid could kill more people than a nuclear weapon, the complete dominance of American air power was undeniable. The final irony of Japan's aerial collapse was that their most dedicated attempts at resistance only hastened their complete defeat. The kamikaze program, intended to inflict decisive losses on Allied naval forces, instead consumed Japan's remaining trained pilots and operational aircraft for minimal strategic gain. The preparation of homeland defenses, including stockpiling of suicide aircraft, represented resources that could have been used for conventional defense or reconstruction, but were instead squandered on weapons that would never be used effectively. In the end, Japan's once feared air power was not defeated in a single decisive battle, but was systematically degraded through a combination of pilot losses, fuel shortages, industrial bombing, and technological obsolescence until it simply ceased to exist as a meaningful military force. The final raids of August 1945, involving over 1,000 American aircraft operating without losses, represented the culmination of this process, not a battle between opposing air forces, but a demonstration of complete American aerial supremacy over a defenseless enemy. The 20 minutes it took American bombers to overfly and devastate their targets on August 1, 1945, represented more than tactical success. They represented the moment when an entire military tradition, built over decades of innovation and dedication, was finally and irrevocably extinguished. Japan's Air Force, which had once dominated the skies from Pearl Harbor to the Dutch East Indies, now existed only in memory, its aircraft destroyed, its pilots dead, its infrastructure obliterated, and its capacity for resistance eliminated. The systematic destruction of Japanese air power in 1945 stands as perhaps the most complete military victory in aviation history, achieved through the combination of overwhelming industrial capacity, technological superiority, tactical innovation, and operational persistence that characterized American strategy in the Pacific War. In a conflict that began with Japanese air superiority and American desperation, the final act was written entirely in American terms. With American aircraft operating at will over a Japan that could do nothing but endure the inevitable consequences of total defeat. As the sun set on the Japanese Empire on August 15, 1945, the skies above Japan were controlled entirely by Allied aircraft, patrolling without opposition over a nation that had finally learned the meaning of true air power. The empire that had once commanded the greatest naval air force in history had been reduced to helpless spectator of its own destruction. Watching from the ground as foreign aircraft wrote the final chapter of its military aviation story in smoke and fire across the evening sky.